So back to where we are now, here in Australasia. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers over the next 3 or so hours, which we're really excited to bring you. And starting with our very first speaker and host for the Australasian section, Mr. Karl Treacher. Karl is the founder of the Culture Institute down in Australia, and is also a great friend of mine. And for those who've seen the Inspirathon before, has started us off on numerous occasions, and we couldn't think of a better person to kick off a 24-hour event than Karl. So without further ado, let's bring him in. Hello, Karl. How are you doing?
Hi, Matt. Thank you. I'm really well. Thanks so much for the very warm introduction. Great to be back.
Great. Well, great to have you. Before we go, I do have to ask, and because I didn't ask before we got going, do you have any slides you'll be sharing today?
No slides. Hopefully I'll be engaging enough not to need them.
Well, definitely will be engaging enough. That makes my life easier too. So without further ado, I'll let you crack on. Speak to you soon.
Thank you, Matt. So yes, as Matt mentioned, Karl Treacher is my name. I'm the CEO of the Culture Institute and founder of CultureCon. I'm coming to you from the northern beaches of Sydney today, which is the Guringai country. I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners and emerging leaders, past, present, and as we move forward into this very uncertain world, our thoughts are with them. Our thoughts are also with the cultures of existing countries and developing countries that are currently at war with one another. My talk today is not about that. It's actually about the introduction and the effect and the impact that AI will have on organizational culture. This is a topic that's this year particularly been very interesting for organizations. Organizations, boards, leaders, executive teams are certainly getting their head in that game. I'm going to talk about that for about 20 minutes. And I'm going to talk about that in hopefully an interesting way that paints a picture around what we're going to see in the future as we move towards an AI integrated culture in organizations. And then I'm going to be a host as we move through other speakers through this particular region in the Inspiring Workplace event. So I wanted to start with a bit of a concern or an issue that I think we all are aware of that sort of comes and goes in a conversation about culture. And that is the definition of culture. And I know people like to start a conversation and a talk with the definition of culture and say it's the way we do things around here. There's a massive identity crisis when it comes to understanding culture, or at least an implementing culture, because it's not well understood and its value is largely underrated. So this idea that a definition of culture is the way that we do things around here, it's really very light on. And the biggest problem with that is it doesn't imbue any sort of accountability in culture. So the idea that it's just the way we do things around here, that could be a statement. It's not really anything to do with how we build culture or what culture means to us. And so I don't like that as a definition. I think it's one that should be buried in the backyard. The other definition, which is more academically referenced, is Edgar Schein's tacit assumptions. Culture is tacit assumptions, which is technically true, but also equally as disengaging. It doesn't really mean anything to executive teams and organizations that I certainly work with. Where I try to push the definition of culture, I won't spend too much time on that, is that it's really about what's expected to be part of this team or community. What's expected of you? How do we go about showing up with our behaviors, symbols, systems, our processes, procedures, priorities, investments, resourcing that makes it very clear around what's expected as part of this team, community, organization? So I think that's a good place for us to start, because as we talk about culture, we need to remember that culture it's shaped by us showing up and being accountable for that. It's not something that we should assume is taking place around us. It will take its own shape. It's like a weed. It will take its own shape and take over. And because of humanity's negativity bias, it's often poor. We end up being fractured. It's siloed. We end up in conflict, and there's a lot of tension. So culture needs to be nurtured. It needs to be nurtured 24/7 and very deliberately. Second point I want to make is just around how fragile culture is. And I want you to think about this in a different way. So culture itself, we used to talk about cultural terrorists. Now in the world that we're in, I don't think that's an appropriate expression, but I do think it's reasonable to say culture can be contaminated. Contaminated because the leading element or the most dominant influence on culture is, of course, leadership. So if you bring a leader into an organization and they're not the right leader and they're counterculture, you're going to contaminate the culture. So our job as leaders, as consultants, as people that work in the mission to build healthy, productive culture is to get really clear on what their culture is and then fortify that, because culture, like a virus, only takes hold if it's allowed to. So if you've fortified your existing culture and a contaminant comes in, there's nowhere for it to go. So either it gets rejected, or it ideally starts reassessing its values and behaviors and then becomes an inclusive part of the culture. And that's how we grow. That's the ideal way to do that. That's sort of the introduction for where I'm heading. So that's the framework before we start talking about the main thing, which is AI going to eat your culture for breakfast? Now, that's saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast, the most overused statement. Was it Peter Drucker? Was it not? Doesn't really matter. It really just suggests that culture is very important, and if without it, your strategy won't work. Sure, we get that. Now we're in a world where in the next couple of years, two very, very big things are going to take place. The first is AI is going to become very prevalent. It's going to be by 2026, 27, we're going to find 80% of interactions are going to be AI enabled, around that number. At the same time, the majority of the workforce will be made up of Gen Y and Gen Z. So we're going to be dealing with two very new phenomenons, both enormous in their own right, coming together in a compound. And so leaders the better leaders anyway, are really starting to get their mind around this at the moment. They're trying to do some investigative analysis. What is it? What are the drivers? What are the things that Gen Y and Gen Z respond to? How will that or won't that work when we start bringing AI to life? So we need to think about AI as not just the sort of automation of operational efficiency. It's really a monumental cultural shift that's required. So at the Culture Institute, my interest professionally and academically at the moment is helping organizations determine how ready they are for AI. So AI culture readiness. So I'd like us to take our mind outside of the bots and the customer service, the obvious elements of AI, and then dive a little bit more into the impact of AI inside culture, and are we prepared for this seismic shift? So what is it going to look like, and can we afford to ignore it? Now, we know that humans as a species are quite adaptive over time, but as a collective in recent time, we're not so good. We don't love change. We have a sort of an inertia that we defer to or default to, and we like status quo. We like homeostasis. So we tend to try and keep things as they are. AI is not going to allow that and not going to afford that to be the case. We have to have organizations, leaders, people, and culture that is prepared for this, because without that, the risks are enormous. So with AI coming into an organization or a culture that's not prepared, you actually could inadvertently codify bias. You could perpetuate inequalities, and you can certainly corrode trust within the organization. So that all sounds like an issue. And in the past, those issues might be able to be solved for, in Australia, we've had royal commissions when there's been issues. When we're talking about AI, some of these issues are irreversible. Okay, I want to leave you with that. When we start talking about the codification of bias, for instance, through AI, you can't undo it. So we need to make sure that in terms of preparedness and doing the work to make sure our culture is ready to accept AI in an ethical and responsible manner, it actually has to be done. And we're going to start seeing a very, very dramatic change of not just competitive advantage, but organizations in general performance and wholesale existence being exposed through this. So at the end of this talk, and I'm only going to share another sort of 10 minutes with you, I'd like us all to sort of have an assessment or a way of reviewing our organization that helps us understand how ready we are or how ready we're not. So what can we expect to see? So we're already starting to see AI take shape. Not so in the way that we will see it in the future. We will see AI coming into existence as almost a colleague. So the things that we do, the people that we rely on, it's just another element of that just happens to be quicker, ideally more accurate, and it fits into our life and the culture that we've nurtured. That's the end state that we're looking for. But imagine walking into your workplace, and instead of relying on your gut feeling or your intuition or your trusted advisors around you, you've got the ability to make immediate decisions that are accurate, and without that collaboration, without that interaction or intersection. There's a bit of a knock-on issue here that we're going to feel a little bit confronted. Humans are going to feel threatened. And we know from all the insights that's already taking place, that our sense of human intelligence and our value in the workplace is existentially questioned to some extent. It's challenged. So we need to have a mindset shift here about this new reality. We don't necessarily love change. There's a lot of benefits to AI coming. It's just to make sure that we're doing this in an ethical and responsible manner. So one of the other things that will take shape and will play out very quickly is there'll be flatter hierarchies. You won't need to go through the layers for decision making because the data will be there. It will be evident what the right or wrong decision is or isn't. Now, big question there is, what is determining that, and is that fair? Again, the consistent thread of ethical, responsible AI has to be present throughout this. So how can AI understand what's fair and what isn't? The same token, is it perpetuating a range of biases that I mentioned before? Because it's very nuanced information. These are really big questions that have to be solved for, have to be discussed at a board level and executive level in preparation for cultural readiness. The other thing we are going to see is cultural resistance, so the fear of the unknown. We know that change scares people. When we talk about AI, we go to robots, we go to redundancy, we go to having less value and becoming irrelevant to some extent. And there's an enormous fear around that, and there is some validity to those fears. So the resistance has to be understood and accepted, because if organizations don't get really clear and on how they're going to do this, prepared, safe, excited, and resourced, it won't happen. The resistance will take over, and then we'll see all sorts of economic implications for that. Give you an example of this. So many banks at the moment, particularly banks because they're large organizations and they've got an important service for the community, are really investing in AI-driven tools and solutions. And they're offering predictive analysis on investment strategies. There's AI-powered chatbots that are well and truly mature at this stage in their existence around customer service. And there's machine learning algorithms for fraud detection. There's a range of banks that have been around for 50, 75, 100, 200 years, and there's enormous legacy practices and static culture in those environments where they have to sort of come in and unlock and defreeze or unfreeze some of the practices. There's a lot of leadership wariness that goes on, and it could be a bank, could be an insurance firm, could be any large organization. And one of the major concerns for them is this depersonalization. So moving forward with AI and culture, it's not around depersonalization. It's how can we be better? How can we be enabled in our human manner just by learning more and having greater resources and tools around us? There's other concerns that are coming the next layer down around customer relationship. So with this depersonalization, how do I feel? I'm actually eroding some of the equity that exists between myself and my customers and my organization and my customers. So there is an element of intuition here that is beyond AI, and that's going to be in play for some time. And so it is really a combination. It's a team effort to have this symbiotic relationship between humans and their AI support. I think it's important to remember that's really the language that we need to stick with. There's also, from my understanding, we've had risk teams and security teams talk to us around doubts around AI security, cyber threat. Are we actually going to be safe? And so there's a movement towards retaining and investing and doubling down on manual surveillance. And whilst there is a human component required in surveillance, it's more about how do we help the AI be better and ethical and make decisions, particularly around fraud, that are accurate, so we don't need the human surveillance. Because when it comes to fraud, AI can detect it immediately in that second, which is actually what really matters when it comes to things of that nature, as opposed to having to move through a series of processes, despite how seamless they might be. So the consequences of some of these challenges that I've mentioned are largely operational efficiencies. So there could be longer wait times for those organizations that are resistant and reluctant. For customers, that will certainly affect their share price, will affect their performance. You'll find that the fraud detection, as I mentioned before, will be much better in organizations that are appropriately and successfully adopting and integrating AI. And in those that don't, particularly when it comes to fraud, they're going to suffer substantial reputation issues because you can't commit fraud or have a fraud situation or a crisis in your organization and stay clear of that. I think the old adage that every reputation crisis starts in culture is actually very true. So if you've got a culture that's accepting AI, you're likely to avoid those reputational challenges themselves. Some of the things I'm talking about here are not siloed aspects. So we're not talking about HR. We're not talking about leadership or customers. So we're talking about what actually is going to be the new normal, which is the cross collaboration across the entire organization to ensure that we're all on the same page. And AI is going to enable us to do that. But the baseline and the foundation for all of that is the ethical and responsible framework that we house AI within. So the old idea of managing silos is really not the way of the future. And even from a cost perspective, and this isn't about displacement of human beings, it's about making us better with the same amount of people just using AI. Maintaining the human element is actually going to be very expensive, and so the cost base will go up. So I suppose the question is, what do we do? What do we do from here? What does this look like? So there's a few things that I suppose, if we look at maybe 4 key things, roles that will transform. So as AI starts taking hold, we're going to need different things. We're going to need a different interface in the way that people that speak AI. So as I mentioned before, the majority of the workplace will be Gen Y and Z in 2025, 26, certainly by 2030. Now, that cohort of those particular demographics have grown up with a very digital enabled language. So for them to speak AI, it's not a big deal. The very small 11% by 2030 of Gen X, which is my generation, have to pedal a little bit harder to make sure that they're fluent and that they understand what they're talking about in terms of actually legitimately understand data and its aspects, and how AI will become enabling or the opposite. Data scientists, for the last little while, they've been hot in the press, and for good reason. They're going to become the consultants of the workplace. So data scientists, instead of being the expert that you might go to for a range of questions, they will actually become the consultants helping organizations understand how they start integrating AI into their practice. The project management will become really critical, and specifically around AI project management, so that smooth collaboration takes place. HR professionals will, HR in general will see a big uplift when it comes to the AI tools that are becoming available. So in terms of recruitment, onboarding, and helping employees settle in smoothly and understand culture, AI is going to be incredibly helpful for that. You can see that through chatbots, avatars that are a welcoming avatar support that might be a mental health or a well-being support as you enter into challenging environments. Incredibly important. Ethics officers are something of the future as well. So before anything gets built, it should really be going through an ethics filter, a responsible AI ethics filter. Are we doing this for the right reasons? Have the right considerations been made before we press go and start automating decision-making, for instance? Finally, last thing I'm going to do is talk about how you can assess your AI readiness inside your organization. And there's 2 elements to this. The first one is the approach. And so you need to be assessing what is our approach. And that is anything from trust, DEI, our learning climate, our growth mindset. What is our approach to AI? So it starts and finishes with trust. Trust is the one thing that is more important than any other thing. So employees have to trust that the organization is using AI responsibly and without bias. And this also includes having the utmost respect for privacy and data protection. Without that, nothing else happens. So step 1, trust. Do we have trust established in the organization, particularly around how we're using AI? What does our DEI look like? Have we actually got programs and positions and frameworks in place that we're actually inclusive in our nature of decision-making? we're not perpetuating any sort of social bias. We're actually being proactive and accelerating culture and diversity and equity and inclusion inside organizations. Learning climate. We've heard a lot about learning, having a learning culture. Well, there's not just one learning culture. There's a learning culture that might be a 1 out of 10, a learning culture that's 10 out of 10. Those learning cultures, those organizations that have a very strong learning culture that encourage exploration and experimentation are going to go much better in this world. So assessing that, what is our appetite? What is our position in terms of learning? Because when it comes to AI, it is perpetual learning. There's new things happening all the time, which comes down to the individual. What's their growth mindset? So some of the more sort of personal, psychographic diagnostics that are around will be looking more at growth mindset. Do we have a position of openness that we're looking to and interested in receiving information? That's the point. That's point one. That's your approach. The second point is execution. So how well, even if we've got everything lined up here with our trust and our learning and DEI and growth mindset, we're ready to go. We're actually primed for this. From an operational efficiency perspective, can we do this? So we need to be looking at how well do we collaborate. I made a point earlier around AI is going to enable and unlock collaboration, and we'll either do that or the organization will fail. And it's going to come to that at some point. So human AI guidelines in terms of collaboration are going to be critical, and they need, again, to be founded in the idea of ethical, responsible AI. So how will it be used? Is it going to be fair? Is there transparency? What does privacy look like? There should also be an element like a kill switch where possible, and I know this isn't always possible with AI, where humans can intervene and override AI if necessary. So we're still in execution here, remember? Approach, execution. First part of execution is how well do we collaborate. Second is, what is our data fluency level? How well do we understand this? Do we need rapid upskilling in data fluency so that we understand what data is actually telling us, how to use that, how we can then transport that information into something that's meaningful for our customers and the organization. Still in execution, one more, which is change management. We are talking about change management on a gross wholesale scale. So organizations that are going to move into AI technologies are going to need to prioritize ethical considerations and this change management, and it's going to be enormous. And as I've said before, humans aren't terrific at change. So we will see, you need to assess this inside your organization. What type of change works? Is it a comms heavy change? Do we start going into the symbols and signals and systems inside the organization that then mandate that change? There's a dashboard that's required to bring change about. And that's really important for you to assess as you move through. Now, I understand, I think my time might be very close to up, so I can move into a case study or I can move into introducing our next speaker.
Hi, Karl. I thought I'd come back and actually just say thank you for you doing the first one as you are host too. You've got 3 or 4 minutes, so it's up to you. We can either wrap it up and with a case study or finish now, and then we'll bring you off and give it a quick pause before you introduce our next speaker. Up to you.
Well, I feel like I've said a lot. I feel like I may have just sort of overindulged in information. So I might leave it so people can let that sort of sink in. But the message really is that the change in the next few years, particularly with that combination of the generational shift and AI being introduced, it's going to be unprecedented. It's enormous.
Yeah, well, you say generational shift in weeks. Just seeing the news on Copilot launching imminently as well. It's hard to keep up. So I really appreciate what is a very complex, huge societal challenge to be broached by in the first session. That's what I probably need an extra Red Bull now to soak all that up. So thank you very much. We'll finish there. Thank you so much. We'll bring you back in to introduce Samantha, who's coming up shortly.
Right.
So everybody will see Karl again in about 2 minutes' time. Thanks, Karl.
Thanks, Matt.